Part 4, Tower of Babylon by Ted Chiang. After climbing for 2 more days, Hilalum had grown more accustomed to the height. Though they were the better part of a league straight up, he could bear to stand at the edge of the ramp and look down the tower. He held on to one of the pillars at the edge and cautiously leaned out to look upward. He noticed that the tower no longer looked like a smooth pillar. He asked Kuda, "The tower seems to widen farther up. How can that be?" "Look more closely. There are wooden balconies reaching out from the sides. They are made of cypress and suspended by ropes of flax." "Balconies? What are they for?" "They have soil spread on them, so people may grow vegetables. At this height, water is scarce, so onions are mostly grown. Higher up, where there's more rain, you'll see beans." Nani asked, "How can there be rain above that does not also fall here?" Kuda was surprised at him. "It dries in the air as it falls, of course." "Oh, of course," Nani shrugged. By the end of the next day, they reached the level of the balconies. They were flat platforms dense with onions, supported by heavy ropes from the tower wall above. Just below the next tier of balconies, on each level, the interior of the tower had several narrow rooms inside in which the families of the pullers lived. Women could be seen sitting in the doorways, sewing tunics, or out in the garden, digging up bulbs. Children chased each other up and down the ramps, weaving amidst the pullers' carts and running along the edge of the balconies without fear. The tower dwellers could easily pick out the miners, and they all smiled and waved at the miners. When it came time for the evening meal, all the carts were set down, and food and other goods were taken off to be used by the people here. The pullers greeted their families and invited the miners to join them for the evening meal. Hilalum and Nani ate with the family of Kuda, and they enjoyed a fine meal of dried fish, bread, date wine, and fruit. Hilalum saw that this section of the tower formed a tiny kind of town, laid out in a line between the 2 streets, the upward and downward ramps. There was a temple in which rituals for the festivals were performed. There were magistrates who settled disputes. There were shops which were stocked by the caravan. Of course, the town was inseparable from the caravan. Neither could exist without the other. And yet any caravan was essentially a journey, a thing that began at one place and ended at another. This town was never intended as a permanent place. It was merely part of a centuries-long journey. After dinner, he asked Kuda and his family, "Have any of you ever visited Babylon?" Kuda's wife, Alitum, answered, "No, why would we? It's a long climb and we have all we need here." "You have no desire to actually walk on the earth?" Kuda shrugged. "We live on the road to heaven. All the work that we do is to extend it further. When we leave the tower, we will take the upward ramp, not the downward." As the miners ascended, in the course of time, There came the day when the tower appeared to be the same when one looked upward or downward from the ramp's edge. Below, the tower's shaft shrank to nothing, long before it seemed to reach the plains below. Likewise, the miners were still far from being able to see the top. All that was visible was a length of tower in either direction. To look up or down was frightening, for the reassurance of continuity was gone. They were no longer part of the ground. The tower might have been a thread suspended in the air, unattached to either earth or to heaven. There were moments during this section of the climb when Hilalum despaired, feeling displaced and estranged from the world. It was as if the earth had rejected him for his faithlessness, while heaven disdained to accept him. He wished Yahweh would give a sign to let men know that their venture was approved. Otherwise, how could they stay in a place that offered so little welcome to the spirit? The tower dwellers at this altitude felt no unease with their station. They always greeted the miners warmly and wished them luck with their task at the vault. They lived inside the damp mists of clouds. They saw storms from below and from above. They harvested crops from the air, and they never feared that this was an improper place for men to be. There were no divine assurances or encouragements to be had, but the people never knew a moment's doubt. With the passage of the weeks, the sun and moon peaked lower and lower in their daily journeys. The moon flooded the south side of the tower with its silver radiance, glowing like the eye of Yahweh, peering at them. Before long, they were at precisely the same level as the moon when it passed. They had reached the height of the first of the celestial bodies. They squinted at the moon's pitted face, marveled at its stately motion that scorned any support. Then they approached the sun. It was the summer season when the sun appears nearly overhead from Babylon, making it pass close by the tower at this height. No families lived in this section of the tower, nor were there any balconies, since the heat was enough to roast barley. The mortar between the tower's bricks was no longer bitumen, which would have softened and flowed, but clay, which had been baked by the heat. As protection against day temperatures, the pillars had been widened until they formed a nearly continuous wall, enclosing the ramp into a tunnel, with only narrow slots admitting the whistling wind and blades of golden light. The crew of pullers had been spaced regularly up to this point, but here an adjustment was necessary. They started out earlier and earlier each morning to gain more darkness for when they pulled. When they were at the level of the sun, they traveled entirely at night. During the day, they tried to sleep, naked and sweating in the hot breeze. The miners worried that if they did manage to sleep, they would be baked to death before they awoke. But the pullers had made the journey many times and never lost a man, and eventually they passed above the sun's level, where things were as they had been below. Now the light of day shone upward, which seemed unnatural to the utmost. The balconies had planks removed from them so that the sunlight could shine through. With soil on the walkways that remained, the plants grew sideways and downward, bending over to catch the sun's rays. Then they drew near the level of the stars, small, fiery spheres spread on all sides. Hilalum had expected them to be spread more thickly, but even with the tiny stars invisible from the ground, they still seemed to be thinly scattered. They were not all set at the same height, but instead occupied the next few leagues above. It was difficult to tell how far they were, since there was no indication of their size, but occasionally one would make a close approach, evidencing its astonishing speed. Hilalum realized that all the objects in the sky hurtled by with similar speed in order to travel the world from edge to edge in a day's time. During the day, the sky was much paler blue than it appeared from the earth, a sign that they were nearing the vault. When studying the sky, Hilalum was startled to see that there were stars visible during the day. They couldn't be seen from Earth amidst the glare of the sun, but from this altitude they were quite distinct. One day Nani came to him hurriedly and said, "A star has hit the tower." "What?" Hilalum looked around, panicked, feeling like he had been struck by a blow. "No, not now. It was a long time ago, more than a century. One of the tower dwellers is telling the story. His grandfather was there." They went inside the corridors and saw several miners seated around a wizened old man. "Lodged itself in the bricks about half a league above here. You can still see the scar it left. It's like a giant pockmark." "What happened to the star?" "It burned and sizzled. It was too bright to look upon. Men considered prying it out so that it might resume its course, but it was too hot to approach closely, and they dared not quench it. After weeks, it cooled into a knotted mass of black heaven metal, as large as a man could wrap his arms around." "So large," said Nani, his voice full of awe. "When stars fell to the earth of their own accord, small lumps of heaven metal were sometimes found, tougher than the finest bronze. The metal could not be melted for casting, so it was worked by hammering when heated red. Amulets were made from it." "Indeed, no one had ever heard of a mass of this size found on the earth. Can you imagine the tools that could be made from it?" "You did not try to hammer it into tools, did you?" asked Hilalum, horrified. "Oh, no. Men were frightened to touch it. Everyone descended from the tower, waiting for retribution from Yahweh for disturbing the workings of creation. They waited for months, but no sign came. Eventually, they returned and pried out the star. It sits in a temple in the city below." There was silence. Then one of the miners said, "I have never heard of this in the stories of the tower." It was a transgression, something not spoken of. And we will leave it there for now. Thanks for watching.